fence here. And we'll talk to them to the roof office downtown Pensacola. It was doing core for about 12 years now. It's been with DDP before that. And before that, came through the program here at UWF. It's all environmental studies now, but I've never named my fifth grade. But in Pensacola, we've got about 10 people. We're actually part of the Jacksonville district. We've got offices all over the state and Puerto Rico. The Corps, not everybody's aware of kind of what the Corps does. You know, there's so many different missions the Corps is involved in. Why they're involved in wetlands is kind of a long story, but it's not to give you the whole history. But looking back, you know, our Army Corps of Engineers obviously started as Army engineering arm of the United States government. But it moved from there basically from coastal fortifications to more protection and navigation issues where it came to there was so much commerce and travel on the water, but Congress said, you know, we've got to have an agency that basically regulates those waterways, protection, make sure navigation stays open. You can't have snags, you can't have derelict vessels out there, but we also can't have structures that are going to impede navigation. So that was one of the earliest missions, and it kind of evolved from there. We got into the 60s, 70s, some of the water pollution laws came into effect. The Corps basically moved from not just protecting navigation, but to covering any type of discharge, any type of construction in the water or the adjacent wetlands. So that's why today, if you need a permit to build your house in wetlands, it goes back to basically some of the early missions that evolved into some of the missions that we're right now today. I don't know how far you guys are as far as your training, where you are in the plant or soil, wetland ecology. What is the name of this class actually? Okay. Well, depending on how many plant and soil classes you have, and you guys are probably aware of, you know, the wetlands basically that you see in the brochures and stuff, of the books, the ones the Corps uses and the state uses, the pictures they use for the brochures a lot of times aren't the best because they show the kind of the pretty wetlands, swamps and marshes and stuff. And those are areas that everybody knows are wetlands. I mean, there's not a lot of confusion. Those are wet areas. It's kind of the in-between areas, the transition areas that we spend a lot of our time delineating and all, and basically dealing with the permitting or enforcement. Those areas that are probably going to be more confusing to somebody who doesn't have a wetland background. They don't know maybe that area is a wetland. So when we're thinking about wetlands, we're thinking about that transition between basically open water and the high dry land. And it's not really just an ecozone. There may be several ecozones which exist in that area, but that's kind of where we spend a lot of our time, is just working that in-between area. With delineation, what we're talking about is basically establishing that boundary between the area that we regulate and that we don't regulate. And it's important that we get that right, because on one side of that line you need a permit to basically having jurisdiction, the government has jurisdiction over what you can do on your property, and the other side it doesn't. So it's important that we get that right. We've got to have a consistent method to do that. The state and the Corps have slightly different methods, and we'll go over a little bit about that when we're walking around the woods there. But basically, back in the 80s, they developed a manual, 1987 manual, still in use today, and it's what the Corps uses. It's got 10 specific procedures for wetlands, for plants and soil, how to basically determine if those areas are hydric, if they're going to be basically wetlands or not. When over time, since the 80s, it was determined pretty quick that was a one-size-fits-all document for the entire country. It didn't always work in some areas, particularly when you've got maybe the southwest and dry washes and all, you don't have a lot of vegetation. You don't have all those indicators in every wetland all over the country. So they've developed regional supplements for each area that's a little more site-specific, a little more helpful to people in the field. Not just us, the regulators, but to the consultants who work for property owners, developers, and help them get the permits to delineate that. I've got a little handout here, just the data form that we use to determine if the point that we're standing on right there is a wetland or not. Like I was talking about, you've got obvious wetlands, you've got non-obvious wetlands. Some of the areas we're going to walk through today, when we walk across the bayou, they're obvious wetlands. Everybody's going to understand this is a area of jurisdiction. But we're going to look up along the edges and I'll kind of show you how we determine where that line is. If you had a control map here, if you had another regulator out there, it may be a couple feet different and all, but if everybody's following the same rules and going by the book, it really should be right along that same line. There shouldn't be a whole lot of discrepancy between those. One of the things that you have to remember, wetlands is they're not always wet. We've had a lot of droughts here the last 15, 20 years. A lot of these areas that we're in, flagging our line, may not look wet at all the day that you're out there. But a lot of those characteristics, a lot of those adaptations in the soil, vegetation, those things are going to be present whether it's basically been raining or not.
Quick question. Sure. You mind if I record?
That's fine. Sure. When you're standing at that point, right there, you're standing at this point I'm standing on, is it a wetland or non-wetland? The stuff at the top on the first page there is really just the location information, who's doing the work, when they're doing it, and basically the conditions of the site. But then right below that, that first box there on the left-hand side, we've got actually three questions. And for it to be a wetland for the Corps of Engineers, the answer to all three of those questions has to be yes. You've got to have the plants, you've got to have the soil, and you've got to have the site hydrology. If you're missing one of those, it's not going to be a wetland. The only exception to that is a lot of times in some areas we're going to see today they've been disturbed or the conditions are just different than they would be naturally. Like if we go into an area that's very much just the vegetation's not there, we can look on adjacent properties. The vegetation's over there, the vegetation's on this side as well. We kind of interpolate that it should be vegetated the same way here. And even though we have to check no, there's not the vegetation because it's all clear. We would explain in the remarks section that it should be where it's supposed to be. But the other two questions, we're going to start with vegetation here in a minute and work in the soils and talk about hydrology as well. And we'll walk down here by the boardwalk and pick that.